I moved to Colorado for work and ended up staying for 3 years. Being from New Mexico, I'd often drive back there on my days off, usually every couple of weeks. Most of these trips were late-night drives through uninhabited stretches of winding two-lane roads. The 3.5-hour trip was dark, isolated, and eerie, with only a handful of cars passing me the entire way. There's one stretch of Route 491 that still gives me chills. It's so remote, you don't even see houses far off in the distance. It was on this road that I experienced something I'll never forget. The first incident happened on my way back to Colorado. It was one of those nights darker than any I'd ever seen, as if the stars and moon were swallowed by the night. For context, I'm open-minded but skeptical. I don't believe in the supernatural without good reason. Up until that point, nothing had truly convinced me otherwise. But that night, everything changed. I had just hit Route 491, the halfway mark of my drive. There's a river that runs alongside the road for a while, and as I approached it, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Looking toward the river, I could see its silver shimmer under the faint moonlight. But something was wrong. Hovering in the middle of the water was a dense, thick fog. It wasn't a typical mist. This was a massive, isolated cloud, rolling slowly toward the road. It had shape and definition, like it was alive. I slowed down to get a better look, my curiosity battling a growing sense of dread. As I rounded a corner to move away from the river, I slammed on my brakes. In the middle of the road stood a massive, hazy gray object. It was the fog. Somehow, it had moved from the river and now blocked my path. It was tall, with rounded edges, almost cloud-like yet solid. I sat there, frozen in terror. My headlights illuminated its edges, and I could see darkness around it, proof it wasn't normal fog. I blinked, and just like that, it was gone. I was shaking as I drove away, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. But that was just the beginning. The next time something happened, I was driving back to New Mexico. It was 3:30 a.m., and I was approaching that same stretch of highway. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught the figure of a man walking along the shoulder of the road. He was hunched over, holding a large walking stick, and wearing a cloak that looked like it was made of animal hide. I slowed down, puzzled by his presence. There were no houses or towns for miles, and seeing someone walking alone on that highway in the dead of night was strange, to say the least. As I passed him, he turned to look at me. His eyes glowed a deep, dark red. I nearly drove off the road. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that I'd imagined it. But just 10 miles later, a dog-like creature, walking on two legs, crossed the road in front of me. It stopped briefly, long enough for me to see those same glowing red eyes before vanishing into the darkness. By this point, I was in full panic mode. I locked my doors, rolled up my windows, and turned on every light I had. I drove as fast as I could to the nearest town, desperate to leave that cursed stretch of highway behind me. The third incident was the worst. I was driving back to New Mexico again when my tire pressure light came on. I pulled over near the river, cursing my luck. It was 2:30 a.m., pitch black, and there was no cell service in this dead zone. Grabbing my flashlight, I leaned out of the window to check my tires. The front looked fine, but the back was flat. As I cursed under my breath, I saw a shadow, a tall, thick figure running toward me from behind my car. My flashlight went out, and I froze, listening to the sound of heavy footsteps slapping against the pavement. They were fast, too fast. I scrambled back inside, locking the doors and rolling up the windows. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but there was nothing behind me except the darkness. Then, I made the mistake of cracking my window to listen. I heard breathing, wet, heavy breathing, like it was just inches from me. Paralyzed with fear, I finally mustered the courage to start the car. But it wouldn't turn over. My car, which had never once failed me, refused to start. Through the corner of my eye, I thought I saw breath fogging up my passenger window. I refused to look, focusing all my energy on starting the car. Finally, it roared to life. I drove 30 miles on a completely flat tire, ruining the rim, but I didn't care. There was no way I was getting out of that car. Later, I told a friend who had also lived in Colorado about my experiences. Before I could finish, he interrupted me. "You've seen things on Route 491, haven't you?" he said, his face pale. He described seeing the same man with the walking stick and red eyes, and even wrote about it in a notebook years earlier. His story mirrored mine exactly. He described in haunting detail how the man transformed into a dog-like creature, just as I had seen. I couldn't believe it. How could we both have experienced the exact same terror years apart? The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. To this day, I avoid Route 491. Whatever is out there, it's not something I ever want to encounter again. And I'll always wonder, how many others have seen it too? This story isn't mine, but it's stuck with me since I was a kid. It's one of those cautionary tales told by someone older and wiser, meant to shape your decisions, your outlook on life. It's haunted me for years, and even now, I can't think about hitchhiking without a chill running down my spine. It's about Nikki, an old family friend. Nikki grew up around the same time as my dad, so this happened back in the early 1980s. She was in her mid-20s then, a kind-hearted soul who always went out of her way to help people. If you knew Nikki, you'd understand. She's the type who'd never think twice about lending a hand. And that's exactly what led to this. She was driving into the city one morning, about a 2-hour trip from the small town where she lived. The road stretched on for miles, surrounded by open fields and occasional clusters of trees. It was quiet, as most of her drives were, until she saw him, a man walking along the side of the road. As she approached, he turned and stuck out his arm, thumb up, the universal sign for hitchhiking. Nikki, being who she was, pulled over without hesitation. She rolled down her window and asked if he needed a ride. He was polite, maybe a little shy, and explained he was heading into the city. Without a second thought, she popped the passenger door open, and he climbed in, tossing a small bag into the back seat. They set off. The first hour passed uneventfully. They chatted about life, the news, and mutual interests. He seemed genuinely pleasant, and Nikki felt at ease. About halfway to the city, they stopped at a small roadside diner. She offered to buy him dinner, and though he protested at first, saying he was low on money, he eventually accepted. She remembered how awkward he seemed about her paying for his meal, but they shared a nice conversation, and soon they were back on the road. When they reached the city, he asked to be dropped off downtown. Before getting out, he turned to her and said he'd like to stay in touch, to maybe catch up someday. Thrilled at the idea, Nikki wrote down her phone number, and he thanked her again, repeatedly, for everything. She drove off, feeling warm and satisfied, proud that she'd done something good for someone who clearly needed it. A week later, she got a call. It was him. But the man who had been so polite and soft-spoken during their ride wasn't the same man on the other end of the line. His voice was different, urgent, shaky. Before Nikki could even say much beyond, "Hello," he began speaking. His words came fast, tumbling over each other. "You should thank God," he said. "Thank God you were raised to be so kind." Nikki froze, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. She didn't understand what he meant. And then he explained. When he'd first gotten into her car, his plan had been to harm her, to hurt her, to kill her. His voice cracked as he confessed. He'd intended to wait until they reached the pit stop. There, he'd planned to attack her, steal her car, and leave her body in a ditch before driving off to start fresh somewhere else. Nikki's stomach turned as she listened, her blood running cold. "But I couldn't do it," he said. "You were so kind to me. You talked to me like I was a person, like I mattered. And when you bought me dinner," he trailed off for a moment, "I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't live with myself if I did." Nikki sat in stunned silence, unable to speak. "Please," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Please, never pick up another hitchhiker." And then he hung up. Nikki tried to call the number back, but it led to a payphone. She never heard from him again. She told me this story countless times as a kid. It was her way of warning me, of teaching me to be cautious in a world that isn't always kind. To this day, I can't think of hitchhiking without her voice echoing in my mind, or the image of her trembling hands as she recounted the call that changed everything for her. I've taken that man's advice, and I never, ever pick up hitchhikers,